I'm not entirely sure what was going on yesterday with the hagiography of Mike Pence. Mike Pence is not a hero. Did he show personal courage on January 6th? Yeah, he did. He was being pressured. He was being threatened. But he was being pressured to do the wrong thing, and he was being threatened because he wasn't willing to do the wrong thing. In fact, what he was willing to do, finally, was his fucking job. I think we take a very wrong turn if we start to heroize people like Mike Pence, or indeed any of the other people who served in the Trump administration who were willing to testify under oath to the committee, but in real time, when they could have made a difference, either said nothing or went on Fox like Justin Miller and perpetuated Donald's lies for him. So let's not get sucked into that, okay? If these people, especially Mike Pence, had stood up right after the election, and I include Mitch McConnell in this as well, and all other Republican leadership, if they had stood up and simply told the truth and done their jobs, none of this would have happened. But they kept letting Donald get away with it. They are all complicit. Mike Pence is at the top of that list. So please, do me a favor. Stop talking about him like he's some great fucking hero. He's not. He is as much of a wimp, as much of a sycophant, and as much of a lickspittle as he was right after the election up until January 6th. And as evidence of this, all we need to know is that the one person, probably the most important witness who was not there yesterday, telling his side of the story as only he could, telling people what Donald said in private conversations between the two of them as only he could, was Mike fucking Pence. When initially asked, Representative Barry Loudermilk of Georgia denied that he had given anybody a tour of the Capitol on January 5th. It was only after footage of his leading a tour came out that he admitted that indeed he had. And of course, his story has been changing on an almost daily basis since then. And his last lie is that he never received the letter from the January 6th Select Committee asking him about that quote unquote tour. Because remember, this wasn't a tour of the rotunda or where the Senate meets or the House of Representatives meets. This was a tour of hallways and stairwells that nobody ever wants to go to simply because they're just really boring. Like there's literally nothing to be taking pictures of unless you're doing, I don't know, say surveillance for a planned insurrection the next day. I think it's safe to say that Loudermilk is in a lot of trouble. And, if he has nothing to hide, the simplest thing for him to do would be to testify for the committee. But of course, that's not going to happen. I have to say, though, that video was one of the most chilling things about the hearings to date, partially because I didn't know it was coming. I didn't know it existed, but partially because it represented, if indeed it's the case, and I honestly can't think of another reason why Loudermilk would have been bringing so-called tourists to these, back hallways of the Capitol building. It just shows how planned it was, how cynical the people involved were and are, and it showed us how deep the rot goes. There have been many moments during these hearings that have made me worry for the future of this country because we came so close, and so many of the people who were involved are pretending that they had nothing to do with it. And once they get rid of Donald, they're just going to go ahead and continue to be the kinds of Republicans who quietly support armed insurrection against our own government. So let's be vigilant about this. The last hearing, John Eastman was the bad guy. The hearing before that, it was Rudolph Giuliani. They can both be tied directly to Donald, but you know what? It was the entirety of the Republican Party, except for Kinzinger, Cheney, and a handful of others who were not in support of taking down the United States government. We cannot let them scapegoat only 3 people when half of the elected officials in this country are complicit. There's a quote from my first book, Too Much and Never Enough, that's been kicking around my head a lot since yesterday's hearing, and it's this. If Donald can in any way profit from your death, he'll facilitate it, and then he'll ignore the fact that you died. I can't think of, I don't mean to sound braggadocious. Just kidding. I don't say that word. I don't mean to sound arrogant, but I do think that quote is a pretty decent summary of exactly what Donald did between January 5th and January 6th. We know that up until January 5th, or I should say the morning of January 6th, Donald didn't know for sure whether or not Mike Pence was going to go along with his plan to steal the election. We saw tweets, we saw statements suggesting that he still believed that a pressure campaign against Pence was going to work. And he thought this for 2 reasons. One, because it always does, right? And in this specific instance, because Mike Pence, up until then, had been such a weak enabler, such a hardcore sycophant, that there was literally no reason for Donald to expect that Pence would turn around and draw a line in the sand. He'd never done it before, and as we know, he's never done it since. So it was, in his view, perfectly reasonable for him to think that Pence would do in what he thought was the right thing, which is refuse to count the votes, send the election back to the states, and help Donald Trump overturn the government of the United States. I think what happened is that when Pence finally dug his heels in, which again must have come as a body blow to him, that somebody so pathetic would, 1, stand up to him, and 2, that somebody so pathetic would not understand the value of Donald's withdrawing his friendship from him, which kind of cracks me up. He knew he had to go in another direction. The insurrectionist attack on the Capitol wasn't an accident. It was the next part of the plan. It's what needed to happen if Plan A failed. So when Donald knew that the armed insurrection was in full flight, and every single person in that building who was a member of our government was at risk of violence and death, he, as one of the people who'd worked in his administration, poured gasoline on the fire. She seemed to be surprised by this, but nobody should be. Donald knew the only way he was going to get what he wanted, and by God, he should always get what he wants, and always has, is to cause the death of the Vice President of the United States, because that would give him an excuse to declare martial law. And if other people had to die too, that's just too bad. Since COVID came and shut down Broadway for the first time in decades, it's taken a while for Broadway to get back on its feet. In fact, a lot of shows finally did come back a year or so ago, only have to shut down again after I think we had our 3rd or 4th wave. So it's been really tough for the industry, for everybody involved in it, from the actors to the musicians to the people running the show backstage. But it seems that things are finally getting back to normal. And there has been this small window of opportunity during which some shows that were closed down came back and then had to close down again after only 2 or 3 weeks of performances, came back for their final hurrah. And now a lot of those are closing. And I was lucky enough to see Girl from North Country, which I had wanted to see since it came out a couple of years ago. It's closing on Sunday. So if you're in New York, I was actually shocked to find that there were a lot of tickets available. So if you're in New York, definitely go see it. It was so extraordinary. It was so moving. And it was the entire thing was based on Bob Dylan's music, or used Bob Dylan's music, but it used it in a narrative way, and the orchestrations were so beautiful that you didn't necessarily know that it was Bob Dylan stuff. The acting was superb. The story was heartbreaking, and I highly recommended it. And it was just a reminder that in the midst of all the horrors we're living through, of the day-to-day stresses we're living through, there is still art. There are still people who dedicate themselves to their art for us. And, in my view, it's why we're all here. So if we maybe spent a little bit more time thinking about that and supporting the arts, maybe some of the horrors would go away. They certainly will have less of an impact on us. So go to the theater, go to museums, read poetry, and support all of it.